The fluorescent lights of the police station hummed their monotonous tune as Detective Sarah Mills spread the missing persons file across her desk. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in the wake of a case that had already begun to consume her. The photograph staring back at her showed a bright-eyed 3-year-old girl with curly dark hair and an infectious smile. Her name was Emma, and she had been missing for exactly 72 hours. The number itself felt like an accusation. Sarah had been a detective for 15 years, long enough to know that the first 72 hours were critical. Beyond that window, the statistics became bleak, the hope dimmed, and the likelihood of a positive outcome dropped precipitously. She'd worked enough missing children cases to recognize the patterns, the rhythms of desperation and false leads that characterized these investigations. But this case was different. This case had captured the city's heart in a way few others had. The circumstances were almost cruelly mundane. Emma's mother, Maria, had taken her daughter to Riverside Shopping Center on a Tuesday afternoon. It was supposed to be a quick outing. Maria needed to pick up a birthday gift for her sister and wanted Emma to help choose it. They'd parked near the entrance, walked through the main doors, and Maria had taken Emma directly to the department store. According to Maria's statement, they'd browsed for about 10 minutes, selecting a nice scarf from the jewelry counter. Then Maria realized she'd left her wallet in the car. She asked a store employee if Emma could stay inside where it was air-conditioned while she ran back to retrieve it. The employee, a young woman named Jessica, had agreed without hesitation. Maria said it would be 5 minutes, maybe less. It took her exactly 4 minutes to retrieve her wallet and return to the department store. But when she walked back through those doors, Emma was gone. Jessica said the little girl had wandered away from the counter, perhaps drawn by something she'd seen. Maria had asked store security to check the surveillance footage immediately, and that's when the real nightmare began. The tapes showed Emma walking toward the rear of the store, where she encountered a middle-aged man near the clearance section. He'd spoken to her for less than a minute before taking her hand and leading her toward the back exit. The man's face was partially obscured by a baseball cap and sunglasses, but his presence on the tape was unmistakable. He was deliberate. He was calculated. He knew what he was doing. Within 2 hours, the police had flooded the shopping center. Within 4 hours, they'd issued an Amber Alert that spread across every news outlet in the state. By evening, Emma's face was on every television screen, every social media feed, and in the hands of thousands of volunteers who began organizing search parties. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a community rallying around one family's catastrophe. Sarah had interviewed Maria herself that first night. The mother was barely holding together, oscillating between frantic energy and complete shutdown. Her husband, David, sat beside her with a blank expression that suggested his mind was protecting itself from information too terrible to fully process. Their other child, a 5-year-old boy named, was with Maria's sister, mercifully spared from witnessing his parents unraveling. She wouldn't go with a stranger, Maria had insisted, her voice cracking. Emma knows better. We've taught her about stranger danger. She wouldn't just leave with someone. But children, Sarah knew, were vulnerable in ways that parental warnings. A confident adult could manipulate a 3-year-old in seconds. An offered piece of candy, a promise to see puppies, a claim that mommy sent them. The methods were legion and devastatingly effective. The investigation had branched in multiple directions. Sex offender registries were cross-referenced against the partial image from the security footage. Police departments in surrounding counties were alerted. The FBI became involved within hours, given the interstate possibilities. Dog handlers were called in to search the wooded areas surrounding the shopping center. Helicopter units flew overhead at dawn, searching for any sign of Emma or the vehicle that had taken her. But the days had passed with agonizing slowness. Day 1 brought nothing. Day 2 brought false. A child matching Emma's description was spotted in a neighboring town, only to turn out to be someone else's lost daughter. Day 3 brought a tip about a suspicious vehicle seen near a gas station, but it led nowhere. The case had begun to take on the texture of every other missing child case Sarah had worked, the desperate hope gradually giving way to a creeping dread that whispered terrible possibilities. The media had seized the story with the intensity they reserved for cases involving attractive victims and photogenic families. Maria and David made a televised plea begging whoever had taken Emma to please bring her home safely. Maria's voice had broken when she spoke directly to Emma, saying things like, "Mommy loves you and be brave, baby." Millions watched those videos and shared them, and with each share, the pressure on the investigation mounted. Officer had been assigned to the case on day 2. Sarah had worked with before and knew his reputation. He was the department's most skilled K-9 handler, having successfully solved 47 cases over his 8-year tenure. His German shepherd, Duke, was legendary in law enforcement circles. Duke had an uncanny ability to track suspects and victims alike, his nose seemingly attuned to the specific scent signatures that eluded other dogs. Had developed a bond with Duke that went beyond typical handler-dog relationships. They moved together with an almost telepathic synchronization. When Sarah first briefed on the case, she'd watched his jaw tighten as he studied Emma's photograph. "We're going to find her," he'd said with a certainty that was both comforting and deeply personal. "I promise you, we're going to find her." By day 6, the original search teams had begun to thin. Volunteers still showed up, but the frantic energy had shifted into something more mechanical, people continuing out of obligation rather than genuine hope. The news cycle, which had led with Emma's story for 72 hours, was beginning to move on to other stories. That's how these things worked in the modern media landscape. The initial tragedy grabbed headlines, but sustained coverage required new developments, fresh angles, renewed drama. Sarah sat in the detective's bullpen, staring at the wall of photographs, files, and leads. Somewhere in this city, a little girl was experiencing hell beyond imagination. And somewhere in this investigation, there had to be an answer. There had to be. She didn't know that officer was about to receive a tip that would change everything. She didn't know that an abandoned warehouse on the industrial side of town held the key to this nightmare. And she didn't know that in just hours, they would find Emma alive, and that the real story, the one that would impact millions, was only just beginning. The tip came through at 3:47 p.m. on day 6, delivered by an anonymous caller to the police tip line. A man's voice, slightly nervous, reported suspicious activity at the Riverside Industrial Complex, specifically at an abandoned warehouse on Meridian Street that had been closed since a manufacturing company relocated 5 years prior. The caller said he'd been driving past the property and noticed a vehicle parked behind the building with its engine running, despite the warehouse appearing completely deserted. He'd seen what looked like fresh tire tracks in the overgrown lot. The hesitation in the caller's voice suggested he wasn't entirely sure if he was doing the right thing, but he dialed anyway. That small act of civic responsibility would prove to be the pivotal moment that changed everything. Detective Sarah Mills immediately flagged the information for officer. They'd both learned that anonymous tips in missing children cases were frequently dismissed or deprioritized. There had been dozens of them already in Emma's case, leading to abandoned cars, empty buildings, and dead ends that wasted precious investigative time. But something about this particular tip resonated. The Riverside Industrial Complex was only 7 miles from where Emma had been taken. The description of a running vehicle suggested someone might still be there. Didn't hesitate. He was out of the station within 15 minutes, Duke secured in the climate-controlled compartment of his K-9 unit. The drive to Meridian Street took less than 10 minutes through afternoon traffic. As approached the industrial complex, he immediately understood why the area would appeal to someone trying to hide. The entire zone had been largely abandoned by legitimate businesses years ago. The remaining structures were dilapidated, surrounded by chain-link fencing in various states of disrepair. The warehouse in question was a massive brick structure with boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered walls. The parking lot was overgrown with weeds, and there was virtually no traffic or pedestrian activity in the area. It was the kind of place where someone could conduct criminal activity without fear of interruption. Pulled his vehicle around to the rear of the building, his hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. His backup was en route, Sarah and 2 uniformed officers, but they were still 5 minutes away. Could have waited, could have exercised proper protocol by remaining in his vehicle until additional officers arrived, but something in his chest was screaming at him. His instincts, honed over 15 years of police work and 8 years of specialized K-9 handling, were sending signals that he couldn't ignore. The vehicle described in the tip was indeed parked behind the warehouse, a nondescript gray sedan with its engine idling. The windows were heavily tinted, and the license plate matched a vehicle registered to a man named Richard Hayes, a name that appeared on the sex offender registry. Made the decision that would haunt him with what-ifs for the rest of his life. He exited his vehicle quietly and approached the warehouse on foot, leaving his radio behind to avoid giving away his position. It violated every protocol, risked his career, and could have gotten him killed, but it also saved Emma's life. The rain had started while he was driving, initially just a light drizzle that was now transitioning into a steady downpour. The sky had darkened prematurely, clouds gathering with the intensity of an approaching storm. Visibility was diminishing by the minute. Kept his hand on his service weapon as he approached the warehouse's rear entrance, a large loading door that hung partially open. The sound of the rain masked most ambient noise, but could hear something else, a faint sound from inside the building that made his blood run cold. It sounded like crying. He pushed through the loading door slowly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim interior. The warehouse was a cavernous space filled with discarded machinery, broken pallets, and scattered debris. Shafts of gray light pierced through gaps in the boarded windows, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere. The crying sound was clearer now, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. His heart was hammering in his chest. Every instinct told him to call it in, to wait for backup, to do this by the book. But that crying, that thin, desperate sound of a child in distress, overrode every protocol, every regulation, every ounce of professional caution he possessed. "Duke," whispered, and the dog emerged from the vehicle immediately. Duke had worked with long enough to understand when protocol mattered and when survival mattered. The K-9's ears were alert, his body language tense. Released Duke from his leash, and the dog moved forward with purposeful strides, his powerful nose working the air. The scent trail was fresh, and Duke locked onto it immediately. The dog led through the warehouse's interior like he was reading a map written in molecular biology. They navigated through fallen metal beams, around abandoned machinery, and past piles of rotting wood. Duke moved with absolute certainty, never hesitating, never second-guessing. The crying was getting louder now, more distinct, and ears could detect undertones of fear and exhaustion that suggested the child had been crying for extended periods. They turned a corner into what appeared to have once been an office area. There, in a small room with a collapsed ceiling and minimal light, Duke's entire body went rigid. The alert came fast, a focused, intense bark that had trained to recognize as the signal for success. It was the sound Duke made when he'd found what he was looking for. His eyes swept across the small room, and there, sitting in a corner surrounded by stained blankets and empty food containers, was a small shape huddled against the wall. It was Emma. She was alive. She was small, filthy, covered in dirt and grime, but she was alive. Her hair, which had been so neatly curled in the missing person photographs, was now matted and tangled. Her pink clothes were torn and stained. She looked terrified, confused, and completely overwhelmed. For a moment couldn't move. The weight of the moment, the reality of it, seemed almost too much for his mind to process. He'd found her. After 6 days of searching, after the fear that they were running out of time, after the dread of the statistics that whispered of terrible outcomes, he'd found her. Emma's eyes focused on for a moment, registering a new presence but not yet able to process what it meant. Then her eyes moved to Duke. Something shifted in that small face. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something different, recognition mixed with desperate hope. Duke, understanding his role in this moment, approached slowly, his body language non-threatening, his movements gentle. The K-9 lay down beside Emma, and the little girl, who hadn't spoken or made meaningful contact with anyone in days, reached out a small hand and touched Duke's fur. Was already reaching for his radio, his voice shaking as he transmitted the message that would send shockwaves through the investigation. "We've got her. We've got Emma. She's alive. We're at the Riverside Warehouse Meridian Street location. She's alive and appears physically stable. Send emergency medical." The response from dispatch was a flurry of activity, sirens activating, units rerouting, the machinery of law enforcement accelerating toward this location. But in that small room, surrounded by the detritus of human cruelty, the only thing that mattered was a K-9 lying beside a traumatized child, providing wordless comfort while the world shifted on its axis. Emma looked into Duke's eyes and seemed to find something there, something healing, something safe, something that suggested the nightmare might finally be ending. She didn't know yet that her real journey, the emotional journey of recovery and healing, was just beginning. She didn't know that this moment, this exact convergence of a dog and a child, would eventually be witnessed by millions. She only knew that in a dark place something light had arrived. And that light had a name: Duke. The emergency room at Children's Memorial Hospital erupted into controlled chaos the moment the ambulance carrying Emma arrived. The medical team was waiting, prepared for a potential pediatric trauma case with unknown injuries and unknown duration of abuse. Pediatric trauma specialists, psychiatrists, and social workers had been alerted hours before Emma even left the warehouse. The hospital had dealt with missing children before, but each case carried its own weight, its own complications, and its own unique psychological dimensions. Doctor, the hospital's chief pediatrician, was the first to examine Emma after the initial trauma assessment. She was physically dehydrated, malnourished, and covered in dirt, but shockingly, she had no significant injuries. Her abductor, Richard Hayes, had apparently kept her alive, providing basic food and water. The physical examination revealed no evidence of sexual abuse, though the psychological evaluation would need to be far more thorough. The absence of physical trauma, while relieving in one sense, created a different kind of mystery. Why had he taken her? What were his intentions? The questions would haunt the investigation for months to come. What became immediately apparent, however, was that Emma's psychological state was far more complicated than her physical condition. She did not speak, not a single word. The pediatric nurses tried to communicate with her using gentle voices and simple language, but Emma's eyes remained distant and unfocused. She would eat when food was offered, but mechanically, without apparent interest or engagement. When her mother, Maria, was brought into the room, Emma showed no visible recognition. She didn't cry, didn't reach out, didn't make any of the responses that would be expected from a 3-year-old, reunited with her mother after 6 days of terror. Maria had collapsed into tears at the sight of her daughter, but Emma had simply stared past her, as if her mother was a stranger, or worse, as if her brain had temporarily lost the capacity to process emotional connection. The sight had devastated Maria, who'd imagined this moment thousands of times over the previous 6 days, always with Emma running to her, arms outstretched, relief and joy overflowing. Instead, she received nothing but a vacant stare from the child she'd given birth to, carried, nurtured, and loved for every moment of Emma's life. Doctor, the hospital's lead child psychologist, explained the phenomenon to the family with clinical precision, but also with genuine compassion. What Emma was experiencing was dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism where the mind essentially separates itself from overwhelming trauma. By shutting down emotionally and verbally, Emma's psyche was protecting itself from processing an experience too terrible for a 3-year-old brain to comprehend. The silence wasn't stubbornness or rejection, It was survival. She's been through something that her mind can't fully process, doctor explained during a family meeting in the hospital's quiet conference room. Maria and David sat on either side of their daughter's psychiatrist, their faces etched with the particular kind of helplessness that only parents of traumatized children truly understand. Emma's brain has activated a protective mechanism. She's essentially gone into hibernation emotionally. It's not permanent, but it means she needs time, patience, and specialized therapeutic intervention. The days that followed fell into a pattern of gentle routine and careful observation. Emma spent her time at Children's Memorial undergoing various physical and psychological evaluations. She had a private room decorated with cheerful murals and soft lighting intended to create a healing environment. Nurses would sit with her, read to her, show her picture books, and ask simple questions that were met with silence. Therapists would come in multiple times daily, always maintaining gentle energy, never forcing interaction, always giving Emma the space to reintegrate with the world at her own pace. The lack of progress in the first week was deeply concerning. Emma's parents and grandparents took shifts sitting beside her bed. Maria would sing lullabies in Spanish, songs she'd sung since Emma was an infant. Emma would lie there, eyes open but seemingly unseeing, listening but not responding. David would hold his daughter's hand and speak softly about happy memories, trips to the park, ice cream on hot days, birthday parties with family. Emma's small fingers would remain limp in his grip, showing neither recognition nor rejection. The media attention surrounding Emma's recovery was intense and at times invasive. News vans camped outside the hospital. Reporters tried to interview family members, hospital staff, and anyone connected to the case. The hospital administration had to implement strict security protocols to keep the media away from the pediatric ward. Thousands of people followed Emma's recovery on social media, and prayer vigils were organized in churches throughout the city. The story of her rescue had captured the public's imagination and heart, but the ongoing struggle with her psychological recovery received far less media attention. There were no updates dramatic enough to hold the news cycle once she'd been physically rescued. Officer visited Emma on the second day of her hospitalization, but without Duke. He'd wanted to bring the K9, knowing instinctively that the dog might reach Emma in ways humans couldn't, but hospital regulations prohibited animals except for certified therapy dogs, and Duke, while performing therapy work on an unofficial basis, wasn't yet registered. Sat beside Emma's hospital bed, studying the small girl who had survived something that could have ended in tragedy. He felt a strange mixture of pride in what he'd accomplished and helplessness at her current state. "You did good, Emma," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him or at least couldn't respond to him. "You were so brave, you survived. You're going to be okay." Emma had stared at the wall, showing no indication that she'd heard him. By the end of the first week, Doctor convened a treatment team meeting. Emma's lack of verbal response and her emotional dissociation were concerning enough to warrant consultation with additional specialists. Child trauma experts were brought in. Neuropsychological testing was conducted. Discussions about medication options were held, though everyone was cautious about medicating a 3-year-old without first exploring other interventions. The consensus was that Emma needed time, supportive therapy, and environmental security, the basic ingredients of childhood trauma recovery. But there was something else that everyone acknowledged but couldn't quite articulate. Emma had shown one moment of what might be described as connection when she touched Duke's fur during the warehouse rescue. For just a moment in the presence of that dog, her blank expression had shifted. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there. A crack in the dissociation. A moment where the little girl inside the traumatized shell had peeked out. That single moment would become the key to everything that followed. 2 weeks into her hospitalization, after Emma had been cleared for discharge but would remain in the hospital's therapeutic care program, Doctor made a decision that broke several protocols but followed the deeper logic of compassionate treatment. She contacted Officer and asked if he would be willing to bring Duke back to the hospital, not as a violation of policy, but as a therapeutic intervention. She explained that Emma showed signs of connection to the dog, and that sometimes, in cases of severe childhood trauma, non-human connection could open doors that traditional human therapy couldn't access. Didn't hesitate. Within hours, arrangements were being made. The hospital administration, moved by the clinical reasoning and the documented lack of progress through conventional means, agreed to make an exception. Duke would be allowed into the pediatric ward, not as a pet, but as a therapeutic tool in Emma's recovery. Nobody knew, on that day when Duke walked into Emma's hospital room, that this interaction would eventually be replicated in a courtroom, witnessed by millions, and would fundamentally change how society treats child trauma survivors in the legal system. The morning of Emma's hospital visit with Duke began with rain, as if the weather itself understood the significance of what was about to transpire. Officer arrived at Children's Memorial Hospital at 9 a.m., Duke secured in the air-conditioned compartment of his K-9 unit. The dog seemed to sense the importance of the occasion, sitting alert and focused as drove through the hospital's underground parking garage and made his way to the pediatric ward entrance. They'd arranged with hospital security to enter through a private corridor, avoiding the media attention that still lingered outside the main hospital entrance. Doctor was waiting for them, dressed in her white coat and carrying an expression that mingled professional hope with personal investment. She'd been Emma's primary psychologist for the 2 weeks the child had been hospitalized, and she'd watched day after day as conventional therapeutic techniques failed to penetrate the wall of dissociation surrounding this small trauma survivor. Emma's lack of verbal response and emotional engagement had begun to concern everyone involved in her care. Some pediatric psychologists had suggested medication intervention. Others recommended longer-term hospitalization with intensive therapy. But Doctor had a hunch, a clinical intuition based on that single moment in the warehouse when Emma had touched Duke's fur. "Thank you for coming," Doctor said, shaking his hand firmly. "I've been reviewing Emma's case files and I believe this might help. There's something about the connection she made with Duke during her rescue that we haven't been able to replicate with human therapists." They walked together through the quiet pediatric hallway, Duke moving with calm professionalism, accustomed to hospital environments from his work as an informal therapy dog at various medical facilities. Had trained Duke extensively in behavioral control, and the dog understood when he was working versus when he was simply being a pet. This was work, important work. Emma's room was decorated with soft pastels and cheerful artwork, but the cheerfulness felt hollow given the reality of the child within. Emma sat in a small chair by the window, staring out at the rainy morning without apparent interest or engagement. She was wearing a pink hospital gown decorated with cartoon characters, her dark curly hair now washed but still somewhat listless. She looked simultaneously much older and much younger than her 3 years, the psychological weight of trauma aging her, while her physical size emphasized her vulnerability. "Emma," Doctor said gently, "we have a visitor today, someone special." Emma didn't turn from the window. Her small hands rested in her lap, fingers limp and unmoving. Doctor exchanged a glance that said everything. They'd tried this approach before, with various visitors and interventions. Emma rarely responded to anything. Released Duke from his leash, and the dog entered the room with measured, gentle steps. Duke had been trained to move slowly around children, to seem non-threatening, to allow the child to approach him rather than forcing interaction. The dog moved to a spot a few feet from Emma's chair and simply lay down, his chin resting on his paws, his dark eyes turned toward the small girl. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, nothing happened. Emma continued to stare out the window, seemingly oblivious to the presence of the large German shepherd in her room. Doctor and exchanged worried glances. Perhaps this approach wasn't working after all. Perhaps Emma's trauma was too deep, too isolating, too complete. Then slowly, Emma's head turned. Her eyes, which had been vacant and distant for weeks, focused on Duke. Something shifted across her small face, a subtle change in her expression that was barely perceptible but unmistakably significant. She stared at the dog, and the dog stared back at her, and in that moment, two beings who had experienced trauma in different ways seemed to recognize something in each other. Emma didn't speak. She didn't cry out or run toward Duke. Instead, she moved with deliberate slowness, sliding down from her chair and crawling across the small hospital room floor toward where Duke lay. The K-9 remained perfectly still, understanding through years of training and deep bond with his handler that this moment required absolute patience and unconditional acceptance. When Emma's small hand touched Duke's fur, Doctor felt tears spring to her eyes. It wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was quiet, intimate, and profoundly healing. Emma's fingers worked through Duke's thick coat, and for the first time since her rescue, the little girl's face showed something other than vacant dissociation. There was recognition. There was connection. There was the faintest hint of a smile. "Good girl," whispered, and he wasn't entirely sure whether he was speaking to Emma or to Duke. Both were being brave. Both were performing a kind of bravery that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with emotional openness. Emma and Duke remained together for an hour that morning. Emma never spoke. The dissociation didn't magically dissolve in the face of the dog's presence, but she maintained contact with him, touching him, sitting beside him, occasionally resting her head against his body. Doctor documented everything, noting the behavioral shifts, the slight improvements in Emma's affect and engagement. It wasn't a cure, but it was a beginning. It was a crack in the wall of traumatic dissociation. When finally prepared to leave with Duke, something unexpected happened. Emma reached out and grabbed his hand. She looked up at him with eyes that were beginning to show awareness, beginnings of recognition. And though she didn't speak, there was a question in those eyes. When would Duke come back? When could she see him again? "Soon," promised, speaking to Emma and to Doctor simultaneously. "Duke will come back very soon." Over the following weeks, Duke became a regular presence in Emma's hospital room. The sessions were carefully structured, monitored by doctor and hospital staff, but they became the cornerstone of Emma's therapeutic progress. With Duke present, Emma began to engage with other therapists. She started to participate in physical activities. She ate more voluntarily. Most importantly, she began to show signs of reintegrating emotionally with the world. Then came the news that would transform everything. The prosecutor assigned to Emma's case, a woman named District Attorney Victoria Marshall, informed Emma's family that the trial of Richard Hayes was scheduled for 9 weeks out. Emma's testimony would be critical. The evidence was strong, but her account of what had happened during those 6 days would seal the case. The problem was devastating. Nobody knew if Emma would ever speak again. Her continued silence, her ongoing dissociation, meant that her ability to testify was in serious question. Without her testimony, conviction would be difficult. Without conviction, justice would be incomplete. District Attorney Marshall visited Emma in the hospital, meeting with her, attempting to explain in the simplest possible terms what would be required. Emma, of course, showed no response. Marshall left the hospital discouraged, wondering how a 3-year-old who couldn't speak could possibly navigate the courtroom system. But Doctor had an idea so unconventional that it violated decades of courtroom protocol, yet was so aligned with Emma's psychological needs that it made perfect sense. She scheduled a meeting with District Attorney Marshall, Judge Harrison, who would be presiding over the trial, and the defense counsel. The meeting would center on a single question: what if Emma didn't have to testify alone? What if she could have a support system in the courtroom, specifically, a therapy animal that had proven instrumental in her recovery? The reactions varied. The defense counsel initially objected, citing distractions and impropriety. Judge Harrison was skeptical but curious. District Attorney Marshall was cautiously optimistic, and somewhere in a police station, officer received a phone call asking if Duke would be willing to make an appearance in court. Nobody anticipated what would happen when that dog walked into that courtroom. Nobody could have predicted that a 3-year-old girl, still struggling with trauma and dissociation, would suddenly find her voice. Nobody knew that in the presence of her hero, Emma would speak words that would echo through millions of hearts and fundamentally change how society viewed child trauma survivors in the legal system. The courtroom date was set. The stage was being constructed, piece by piece, for a moment that would define not just this case, but the future of how courts would interact with traumatized children. The morning of the trial arrived with autumn sunlight streaming through courthouse windows, illuminating dust particles that seemed to carry the weight of what was about to unfold. The county courthouse was a grand structure built in the 1950s, all marble columns and imposing architecture designed to inspire both respect for the law and an instinctive sense of intimidation. The hallways were already crowded with reporters, court observers, and interested citizens who had followed Emma's story from her abduction through her rescue and recovery. Security personnel had established perimeters to manage the media frenzy that had descended upon this small-town trial with the intensity of a national event. Inside Courtroom 4B, Judge Harrison was preparing for what she knew would be one of the most emotionally charged proceedings of her 23-year career on the bench. She'd reviewed the motions and regarding the presence of the K9 therapy dog. The defense had filed last-minute objections, arguing that the presence of such an animal would prejudice the jury, would serve as an emotional manipulation, and would violate established courtroom protocols. But Judge Harrison had studied the case materials, had reviewed doctors' clinical assessment, and had come to a conclusion that prioritized the child's over rigid procedural convention. She would allow it. Richard Hayes, the defendant, sat in a holding cell beneath the courthouse awaiting his entrance into the courtroom. He was a 54-year-old man with a history of psychological issues and prior offenses, though none previously involving children. He'd been remarkably calm throughout the pretrial proceedings, showing minimal emotional response to the charges against him. His defense attorney, a competent but ethically challenged man named Robert Harrison, no relation to the judge, had built a strategy around reasonable doubt and procedural technicalities rather than denying the fundamental facts of the case. Hayes had consistently maintained that he'd intended no harm, that he'd merely wanted to help the child, a delusional narrative that his attorney was prepared to exploit in cross-examination. Emma arrived at the courthouse at 9:30 a.m. with her grandmother, Martinez, who held the little girl's hand as they entered through a private side entrance, specifically arranged to avoid media exposure. Emma was dressed in a pale pink dress that her grandmother had chosen carefully, something that would look vulnerable and age-appropriate on the courtroom cameras, but also something that Emma found comforting. The little girl was understandably anxious. Even at her young age, she seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, that her role in this courtroom was essential and consequential. Doctor was waiting for them in a quiet witness preparation room. She'd spent weeks preparing Emma for what the courtroom would be like, using dolls and diagrams and age-appropriate explanations to help the child understand what would be expected of her. But preparation could only go so far. Emma was still largely nonverbal, still showing signs of dissociation and trauma, still fragile in ways that the courtroom environment could only exacerbate. Emma is going to go into a big room, Doctor explained once again, kneeling down to Emma's level. There will be many people in that room. It might feel scary, but you know what? Duke is going to be there with you. Remember Duke, your hero. At the mention of Duke, Emma's eyes showed the first sign of genuine awareness. She nodded slightly, a microscopic gesture that Doctor had learned to recognize as Emma's way of communicating affirmation. At 10 a.m. precisely, the courtroom doors opened. The gallery was packed, a mixture of family members, law enforcement, court observers, and journalists who had positioned themselves strategically to capture every moment. The jury had been specially selected, screened for any potential bias, and instructed on the unusual nature of these proceedings. Judge Harrison had explained to them that they would be witnessing the testimony of a very young, very traumatized child, and that they should focus solely on her words and factual statements, not allowing their emotions or the circumstances to cloud their judgment. It was an instruction that sounded reasonable in principle, but was nearly impossible to follow in practice. The prosecution's opening statements had been delivered the previous day. District Attorney Victoria Marshall had outlined the case methodically: the security footage, the timeline, the physical evidence, the confession that Hayes had eventually provided to police. But everyone in that courtroom knew that the real case rested on Emma's testimony. A jury of adults needed to hear, in Emma's own words, what had happened during those 6 days. Emma was called to testify at 10:47 a.m. She walked into the courtroom holding his hand, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. News cameras positioned outside the courtroom captured every moment. The little girl looked impossibly small in that vast space, surrounded by adults and legal machinery designed for a world far more sophisticated than a 3-year-old could understand. She was directed to the witness stand, where a special cushion had been placed to elevate her so that she could see over the edge and be seen by the jury and the judge. The bailiff administered the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" he asked gently, aware that he was addressing a child who could barely speak. Emma made no response. She stared at the bailiff with vacant eyes, showing none of the comprehension that the question required. Judge Harrison intervened. "Emma, do you understand that in this room we only tell what is true, not things that are not true?" Emma's small chin trembled slightly, but she remained silent. The prosecutor began asking foundational questions, her voice gentle and practiced from years of working with child witnesses. "Emma, can you tell me your name?" Silence. "Emma, do you know where you are right now?" Silence. The courtroom began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. Jurors exchanged glances. The defendant's attorney leaned back in his chair with something that might have been a satisfied smile. This was not working. This was failing in real time, and everyone could feel it. Then Judge Harrison made the decision that would define the entire trial. She looked toward the back of the courtroom and nodded. Officer, who had been waiting in the hallway with Duke, received the signal through his earpiece. He walked through the courtroom doors with the German Shepherd at his side. The reaction was immediate and profound. News cameras flashed. Jurors sat forward in their seats. Emma's grandmother gasped audibly. Even some of the court officers showed visible emotional response. Duke was led to the space beside the witness stand. The K-9 lay down, his body positioned so that he was directly in Emma's line of sight. His dark eyes focused entirely on the little girl who had been rescued from darkness by his tracking skills and his presence. Emma's entire body seemed to awaken. Her eyes, which had been distant and unfocused, suddenly blazed with recognition. Her hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. Her small mouth opened. For the first time in weeks, truly in control and aware, Emma spoke. The prosecutor asked gently, "Emma, who is this?" And Emma, pointing directly at Duke with a trembling hand, her voice clear and strong in a way that seemed impossible given her trauma and her weeks of silence, said 2 words that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of not just this trial, but the entire legal system's approach to traumatized child witnesses. "My hero." The courtroom exploded into an electric moment of collective human emotion. The jury members had tears streaming down their faces. Judge Harrison removed her glasses and wiped her eyes. District Attorney Marshall placed her hand over her heart. Even the bailiff and court officers showed visible emotional response. Emma's grandmother stood up in the gallery, her hands covering her mouth as tears of gratitude and overwhelming emotion poured down her face. But what nobody in that moment realized was that a courtroom reporter had been filming Emma's statement for the court record. That camera, positioned to document the unusual legal proceedings, was also transmitting a live feed to news outlets covering the trial. Within minutes, Emma's 2 words would be heard by millions. Within hours, they would be the most watched moment in recent legal history. Within days, they would be shared across every social media platform, viewed over 50 million times, and would trigger a global movement of compassion, healing, and systemic change. Emma looked at Duke again, and the dog's tail wagged slowly, a gentle motion of pure, unconditional love and recognition. In that moment, everything changed. The trial, the legal system, the national conversation about trauma and healing, all of it shifted on the axis of 2 words spoken by a 3-year-old girl who had found her voice in the presence of her hero. The moment stretched and expanded into something almost sacred. Emma, who had spoken only 2 words since her rescue weeks earlier, seemed to have unlocked something fundamental within herself. The simple statement, "my hero," had cracked open a door that trauma had sealed shut. Now, with Duke's physical presence beside her and his unwavering attention focused entirely on her, Emma found that the words, the terrible, necessary, healing words, were suddenly accessible. District Attorney Victoria Marshall recognized the significance of this moment with her prosecutor's instinct. She knew she needed to move carefully and deliberately, asking questions in a way that would allow Emma to tell her story without further traumatizing her, but also in a way that would provide the jury with the testimony they needed to understand the full scope of what Richard Hayes had done. Every word Emma spoke was being recorded, being documented, being preserved for appeal and for history. "Emma," Marshall said, her voice pitched lower and gentler than it had been during the opening statements, "can you tell me what happened? Can you tell me about the day you went away?" Emma's small hand remained on the edge of the witness stand. Her eyes never left Duke. The K-9's presence seemed to have become an umbilical cord connecting her to safety, to the real world outside the warehouse, to a version of herself that had survived. "Man," Emma said, her voice small but audible throughout the courtroom. It was barely more than a whisper, but every ear in that room strained to capture each word. "Man took me." "Do you see that man in this room?" Marshall asked, gesturing toward the defendant's table. Emma glanced at Richard Hayes for just a moment, a quick, fearful look before her eyes returned to Duke. She nodded, a small but definitive gesture. "That man." The jury members were riveted. This was no longer abstract legal testimony. This was a child bearing witness to her own trauma, identifying her abductor with absolute certainty. The emotional reality of what she was communicating transcended the courtroom setting entirely. "What happened after the man took you, Emma?" Marshall asked. "Where did he take you?" "Dark place," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "Scary dark place. No windows, cold." She paused, and for a moment it seemed as though the dissociation might return, as though the weight of the memories might overwhelm her again. But then Duke shifted slightly, his body settling more firmly against the witness stand, and Emma's voice returned. "He gave me food, bad food. I was scared." "Were you scared he would hurt you?" Marshall asked carefully, watching Emma's reactions with a therapist's awareness of the line between necessary disclosure and re-traumatization. Emma nodded emphatically, a gesture that seemed to gather momentum the more she used it. "Very scared. I cried. I wanted my mommy." In the gallery, Emma's grandmother began to sob silently, her shoulders shaking with the particular pain of hearing her granddaughter describe the terror she'd endured. Emma's parents, seated in the front row of the gallery, held hands so tightly that their knuckles went white. This was their daughter, their baby, reliving the worst days of her short life, and they could do nothing but bear witness and support her through it. "Emma, did the man do anything to hurt your body?" Marshall asked, using clinical language appropriate for a legal setting but with underlying concern for the child's. Emma was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her small hands, examining them as though seeing them for the first time. "He grabbed my arm. He was rough. He was angry sometimes." "Did he do anything else?" Emma shook her head firmly. This was consistent with the physical examination findings. There had been no evidence of sexual abuse, and the psychological profile suggested that Hayes' motivations were complex but did not involve predatory sexual behavior. This didn't diminish the severity of his crimes, but it was an important distinction for the record. The prosecutor continued with her questioning, moving systematically through the timeline of events. Emma answered with increasing confidence, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. It was as though the act of verbalization itself was therapeutic, as though by naming what had happened, she was taking control of her own narrative. Each answer seemed to empower the next response. "How did you know when the man was going to come into the room?" Marshall asked. "His shoes," Emma said without hesitation. "Big shoes, heavy shoes. He stomped when he walked. I heard him coming. I got scared." "Did he ever leave you alone?" "Yes, he would go away for a long time. I was scared he wasn't coming back. Then I was scared he was coming back." It was a devastatingly accurate description of the psychological torture that confinement and uncertainty created. The paradoxical fear of abandonment combined with terror of the abuser's return. The defense attorney, Robert Harrison, had taken notes during Emma's testimony, looking for inconsistencies or signs of coaching that he might exploit in cross-examination. When District Attorney Marshall finally concluded her questioning, Harrison approached the witness stand with the careful demeanor of a man who knew he was on dangerous legal and ethical ground. The jury was emotionally invested in Emma. Any aggressive cross-examination would backfire spectacularly. "Emma," Harrison began, his voice intentionally gentle and non-threatening, "do you like dogs?" It was a seemingly innocuous question, but his strategy became apparent immediately. He was trying to establish that Emma's favorable testimony regarding anything dog-related might be influenced by her emotional attachment to Duke. It was a legitimate cross-examination technique, but under these circumstances, it came across as almost obscene. A man attempting to discredit a 3-year-old's identification of her own abductor by suggesting her emotional state was compromised by the presence of a therapy animal. "Yes, I like dogs," Emma answered simply. "Duke saved me. Duke is my hero." Several jurors shifted visibly in their seats. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with of her own, looked at the defense attorney with something approaching contempt. Harrison attempted a few more questions, trying to establish whether Emma had been coached in her testimony, whether she truly remembered details, or whether she was simply responding to leading questions, whether her identification of the defendant was based on genuine memory or suggestion. But Emma answered every question with the directness and specificity that only genuine memory could provide. She described Hayes' voice, his mannerisms, specific things he'd said. She remembered the smell of the warehouse, damp and moldy. She remembered the sound of rain on the metal roof. These were not details a 3-year-old would fabricate or imagine. They were the sensory memories of lived experience. When Harrison finally concluded his cross-examination and returned to his seat, it was clear that his strategy had failed. If anything, his questioning had reinforced Emma's credibility by demonstrating that her testimony held up under scrutiny. Judge Harrison reconvened the court after a brief recess. Other witnesses, police officers regarding the investigation, forensic experts regarding the physical evidence, doctor regarding Emma's psychological condition and recovery. But everyone in that courtroom understood that the trial had essentially concluded when Emma spoke those words, and then sustained her testimony with the kind of devastating detail that only authentic trauma survivors could provide. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard Hayes was convicted of kidnapping, endangerment of a child, false imprisonment, and several related charges. His sentencing would come later, but the verdict was essentially predetermined the moment Emma said "my hero" and pointed at Duke. As the courtroom emptied, with media representatives rushing toward their cameras to transmit the news, Emma remained in the witness stand for a moment longer. She reached down and touched Duke's head, running her small fingers through his fur. The K9's tail wagged steadily, a motion of unconditional love and acceptance. And in that simple gesture, a traumatized child finding solace in the presence of the being who had saved her, lay the truth of what this trial had really been about. Not legal procedure or prosecutorial strategy, but the fundamental human capacity to heal, to connect, and to transform trauma into testimony that changes the world. The video of Emma pointing at Duke and saying, "my hero," was uploaded to social media at 2:47 p.m. on the day of her testimony. By 3:15 p.m., it had been shared over 50,000 times. By 5 p.m., the view count had reached 2 million. By midnight, the number had climbed to 15 million. By the following morning, it had been viewed by nearly 100 million people across multiple platforms and continents. What had occurred in that small-town courtroom had somehow transcended the boundaries of local news and entered the collective consciousness of the global internet, resonating with something fundamental in human nature: the desire to witness courage, transformation, and the healing power of unconditional connection. The comment section beneath the video swelled with an outpouring of emotion that was remarkable in its consistency and depth. People from every conceivable background, different countries, different languages, different belief systems, responded to Emma's moment with tears and solidarity. Parents talked about protecting their children. Trauma survivors shared their own stories of recovery. Dog lovers celebrated Duke's heroism. Mental health professionals discussed the therapeutic implications. Teachers said they showed it to their classes. Religious leaders incorporated it into sermons. The two words "my hero" became a cultural touchstone, referenced in conversations worldwide. Within 3 days, Officers Department received over 10,000 emails from people around the world expressing their appreciation for the work he and Duke had done. The police station's switchboard was overwhelmed with incoming calls. Local news crews camped outside the police precinct. National news networks requested interviews. Found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight, suddenly recognized in public places, stopped by strangers who wanted to thank him or hug him, or simply express their emotional connection to his story. The police department's administration, recognizing both the positive publicity and the need to channel the overwhelming public response, established a donation fund specifically for the K9 unit. They expected perhaps $10,000 or $20,000, a modest but meaningful boost to their canine training and equipment budget. Instead, the fund received over $2 million within the first month. Donations came from individuals, from corporate sponsors, from international supporters who had been moved by Emma's story. Police departments across the country began calling, asking how they could replicate the program, how they could train therapy dogs for use in trauma cases, how they could implement Duke's model in their own jurisdictions. District Attorney Victoria Marshall found herself fielding calls from legal organizations, academic institutions, and policymakers who wanted to discuss the implications of Emma's testimony and the role that therapy animals had played in facilitating a traumatized child's ability to communicate in a courtroom setting. She began receiving invitations to speak at legal conferences, to consult on cases involving traumatized witnesses, to advise on legislative reforms. The trial had elevated her profile significantly, but more importantly, it had given her a platform to advocate for systemic change in how the legal system treated vulnerable witnesses. Judge Harrison, the judge who had made the unconventional decision to allow Duke in the courtroom, began receiving letters from judges across the country asking for guidance on similar cases. She was invited to speak before judicial conferences about trauma-informed courtroom procedures. Her decision, which had seemed risky and potentially precedent-breaking when she made it, now appeared visionary. She had trusted her instincts and her understanding of child psychology, and that trust had been vindicated in the most public way imaginable. Emma's case led to immediate legislative action in her home state. Within 6 months, what became known as Emma's Law was drafted and passed through the state legislature with remarkable bipartisan support. The law authorized the use of certified therapy animals in courtrooms to support vulnerable witnesses, particularly children who had experienced trauma. The legislation specifically protected the animal's presence from being used as grounds for appeal, while also establishing clear standards and protocols for how such animals could be utilized within the legal system. 17 additional states would eventually pass similar legislation, all directly inspired by Emma's courtroom moment. Legal scholars began publishing papers about the intersection of trauma psychology and courtroom procedure. Universities developed courses examining the case. Law schools incorporated Emma's testimony into their curricula as a study in how compassion and conventional procedure could be reconciled to serve justice more effectively. But perhaps the most profound impact occurred at the grassroots level, in communities and schools throughout the country. Emma's story became a teaching tool for discussing trauma, resilience, and the human-animal bond. Teachers used the video to initiate conversations with their students about courage, about speaking up, about asking for help. Therapists showed the footage to traumatized clients, using Emma as a living example of the possibility of recovery and voice reclamation. Support groups for childhood trauma survivors incorporated Emma's story into their meetings, with survivors sharing how witnessing her testimony had given them hope and strength. Children's hospitals across the country began implementing animal-assisted therapy programs, directly inspired by the evidence that Emma's case had provided. Mental health professionals recognized that what had worked for Emma, the presence of a non-threatening, unconditionally accepting being, could be applied to countless other trauma survivors. The field of animal-assisted therapy experienced a renaissance of interest, funding, and research. Emma's grandmother, Martinez, found herself becoming an unexpected spokesperson for trauma recovery and family resilience. She gave interviews to major news outlets, discussing what it had been like to watch her granddaughter suffer, to witness her recovery, and to see her find her voice in that courtroom. Her willingness to share her family's story, to discuss the intimate details of trauma and healing, opened conversations in countless other families who had been struggling in silence. The Riverside Police Department established an annual award in officer's name, given to law enforcement officers who demonstrated exceptional innovation in victim advocacy and trauma-informed policing. The first award went to himself, though he protested that he was simply doing his job. The department disagreed, recognizing that what had done, trusting his instincts, pushing boundaries, prioritizing compassion alongside protocol, represented the future of law enforcement. Doctor's therapeutic approach to Emma's recovery became a model for pediatric trauma treatment. She was invited to lead training workshops for mental health professionals, teaching clinicians how to recognize when unconventional interventions might be necessary and how to advocate for their implementation within institutional settings. Her clinical notes from Emma's case became required reading in several graduate psychology programs. Media organizations, recognizing the profound impact of Emma's story, created documentary content examining the complete arc of her journey, from abduction through rescue, recovery, and testimony. The films were watched by millions, translated into dozens of languages, distributed to schools and mental health facilities worldwide. Emma's face became recognizable globally, but more importantly, her story became a catalyst for systemic change. 1 year after Emma's testimony, the city where she lived declared Emma and Duke Day, an annual celebration commemorating not just their specific story, but the broader principles of courage, compassion, and the transformative power of healing. Thousands attended the first celebration, with Emma, now noticeably more confident and verbally expressive, standing beside Duke as they received the city's gratitude and recognition. The two-word phrase, "my hero," had become more than just Emma's words. It had become a rallying cry for a new understanding of how society should treat trauma survivors, how the legal system should prioritize healing, and how the human-animal bond could serve profound purposes beyond companionship. A 3-year-old girl and a German shepherd had inadvertently sparked a movement that was changing policies, practices, and perspectives worldwide. What had begun as a personal tragedy had transformed into a universal catalyst for compassion and systemic reform. 5 years had passed since Emma pointed at Duke in that courtroom and spoke the two words that would alter the trajectory of her life and the lives of countless others. The 8-year-old girl who sat in her school's library on a Tuesday afternoon bore little resemblance to the traumatized 3-year-old who had been silent and dissociated in the weeks following her rescue. She was confident, articulate, and possessed an emotional maturity that came from having survived something that should have broken her, but instead had strengthened her. Emma was working on a school project about animals and their impact on human society when her teacher, Mrs., paused beside her desk. "Emma, how's the research going?" she asked warmly. "I want to write about therapy dogs," Emma said, her voice clear and purposeful. "I want to tell people about how Duke saved my life twice, once in the warehouse and once more when I couldn't find my words." Mrs. smiled, aware of Emma's history, but also aware that Emma had integrated her traumatic past into her identity in a healthy, constructive way. She wasn't defined by her trauma, but she wasn't hiding from it either. She was using her experience to help others understand the power of healing and connection. Emma's family had thrived in the 5 years following the trial. Her parents had worked through their own trauma with professional support, and their marriage, which had been tested by the crisis, had actually strengthened. Her younger brother had grown into a protective older sibling figure despite being younger in age, a role he'd taken seriously after understanding what his sister had endured. Emma's grandmother had become an activist and advocate, traveling throughout the country speaking about trauma recovery and family resilience. She'd written a memoir titled "My Hero Too," a grandmother's journey through a granddaughter's trauma that had become a bestseller, with proceeds going to child advocacy organizations. Officer had experienced his own transformation. The widespread attention and recognition had initially been overwhelming, but he'd channeled it into genuine advocacy work. He'd been promoted to lieutenant and now oversaw a specialized unit dedicated to K-9, assisted trauma intervention. He'd consulted on cases in 43 states, trained handlers in 17 countries, and had become a recognized expert in the intersection of animal behavior and trauma therapy. Universities invited him to lecture. Police academies incorporated his methods into their curricula. His success, however, remained grounded in his fundamental belief that compassion and protocol were not mutually exclusive. They were complementary forces that, when properly balanced, could serve justice more effectively than either could alone. Duke, now in his declining years at 13, had retired from active police work 5 years ago. The German Shepherd had become a full-time therapy dog, working with Emma and other trauma survivors in clinical settings. Duke lived in a comfortable home with his wife, Sarah, whom he'd married 2 years after Emma's trial. The dog was increasingly arthritic, moving more slowly than in his younger years, but his presence remained as therapeutically powerful as ever. Emma visited Duke every Saturday afternoon, and their ritual had become sacred. Emma would arrive with treats, spend time grooming Duke, reading to him from her favorite books, sometimes just sitting beside him in comfortable silence. "Duke's getting old," Emma had said one afternoon, stroking the dog's graying muzzle. "But he doesn't seem sad about it. He just seems happy to be here." Had nodded, understanding that Emma was processing concepts of aging and mortality with unusual maturity for an 8-year-old. "Duke had a big life," had replied. "He helped a lot of people. He changed the world, actually, and now he gets to rest. He changed my world, Emma had said simply. Doctor, the psychologist who had first recognized the therapeutic potential of Emma and Duke's bond, had continued her pioneering work in trauma-informed care. She'd published 3 peer-reviewed studies on animal-assisted therapy for childhood trauma, with Emma's case serving as the foundational example. She'd been invited to join the faculty at a prestigious university's psychology program, and now trained the next generation of mental health professionals in trauma-sensitive treatment approaches. Her clinical notes from Emma's case had become required reading in graduate psychology programs worldwide. Judge Harrison had retired from the bench 2 years after Emma's trial, but had remained active in judicial reform efforts. She'd founded an organization dedicated to implementing trauma-informed courtroom procedures across the country. She consulted with judges, wrote extensively about the intersection of law and psychology, and had become a leading voice in advocating for systemic changes that prioritized victim alongside legal procedure. Her decision to allow Duke in Emma's courtroom, which had seemed risky at the time, was now studied in law schools as an example of judicial wisdom and compassion. Emma's law had evolved beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. What started as legislation allowing therapy animals in courtrooms had expanded into a broader framework for trauma-informed legal procedures. 16 additional states had passed similar legislation, and 7 countries had implemented comparable policies. The law had been refined through years of court applications and had become a model for how legal systems worldwide could better serve vulnerable witnesses. The impact on trauma survivors had been measurable and profound. Research showed that children who, in the presence of certified therapy animals, experienced significantly lower rates of secondary traumatization. Their testimony was consistently more detailed and coherent. Their recovery trajectories improved. The presence of the animal seemed to create a psychological safe space that allowed traumatized children to access memories and speak truths that they otherwise couldn't articulate. Emma had become something of a reluctant celebrity in her community. Local news occasionally ran anniversary pieces about her case. The shopping mall where she'd been taken had become a monument to resilience, with a memorial garden dedicated to child safety and trauma recovery. Annual fundraising galas were held in Emma's name, with proceeds going to child advocacy organizations and trauma treatment programs. Emma attended these events with her family, though she tried to minimize the attention, preferring to focus on school, friendships, and normal childhood experiences. But Emma understood, in the way that perceptive children sometimes do, that her story mattered beyond her own personal narrative. She'd been given an extraordinary gift, not just survival, but a platform, a voice that could amplify the experiences of other trauma survivors who didn't have media coverage or public attention. She took that responsibility seriously, not with the heavy burden of obligation, but with the purposeful clarity of someone who understood that her survival and recovery could serve a larger cause. At school, Emma was known as a compassionate and insightful student. She had an uncanny ability to recognize when other children were struggling, to offer support, to listen without judgment. Teachers noted that she seemed to have an emotional intelligence unusual for her age. Her guidance counselor suspected that Emma's experience with her own trauma and recovery had given her a profound understanding of human suffering and resilience. When asked by a journalist what she wanted to be when she grew up, Emma replied without hesitation, "I want to help people like me, people who've been hurt and don't know how to talk about it. I want to use my story to help them find their voice, like Duke helped me find mine." Officer, watching Emma's interview from his office at the police station, felt tears in his eyes. He'd saved this child from a warehouse 5 years ago, but somehow, she had saved something in him too. A reminder of why he'd chosen this profession, a testament to the power of compassion, and a living example of how trauma could be transformed into wisdom and purpose. Duke, resting at his feet, seemed to sense his handler's emotion. The dog lifted his head slightly, placed it on its lap, and simply remained there, offering the same wordless comfort that had healed a traumatized 3-year-old and had ultimately changed the world. Emma's case had become more than a legal precedent or a media sensation. It had become a story about transformation, not just Emma's transformation from trauma survivor to thriving child, but also society's transformation in how it understood and responded to childhood trauma. The 2 words "my hero" had become a reminder that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from institutional systems or professional protocols, but from the simple, unconditional presence of another being who says, without words, "You are safe, you are seen, you are loved." Emma would carry that truth forward through her education, her career choices, her relationships, and her life. She would become a therapist, working specifically with childhood trauma survivors. She would write books sharing her story. She would speak at conferences and universities. But more importantly, she would live as a testament to the possibility of recovery, the power of voice, and the transformative potential of healing. And somewhere in every victory, every moment of courage, every child she helped find their voice, Duke would be there too, not physically, but in spirit. A reminder that heroes come in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest heroism is simply showing up, being present, and loving unconditionally.